Okay, everybody, gather round your listening device. It is time for Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. I thank you for tuning into the show. I hope you enjoy what we've got for you today. I really enjoyed this conversation. My guest is Dr. Karina Moreno. She is an associate professor in the Department of Urban Policy and Planning at Hunter College, City University of New York, or CUNY to those that know. And I wanted to bring her on because she knows a lot about, her work is on immigration and border security and the privatization of, incarceration and policing. She has a lot of angles to give us that can complicate our understanding of the immigration question and how that's changed under Biden. Because as we get into in this conversation, there's a lot of bullshit out there, and all the stuff about like kids in cages and building the wall and all the sort of ugly rhetoric of that sort of infects our political conversations about immigration. All that sort of masks a much more complex picture, and she's got a great perspective on it, not only as an academic, but as someone who has experienced the immigration process and has a lot to say about it. This was a really fun conversation. I hope you enjoy it. If you like what we do on Nostalgia Trap, a good way to support us and get access to all our bonus material is go over to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. That's where we have a lot of bonus episodes and book reviews and movie episodes and stuff like that. And you can subscribe and get access to all that and support our little project. We appreciate it. And please enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Karina Moreno. All right. Well, Karina, I'm very glad to see you, and I'm very glad that you're joining us today. In part because I read your piece in Jacobin recently, and it explained a lot to me, and it made me think that the immigration conversation, which I live in Southern California, so it's been around me my whole life, but it's, it got in the Trump years, it got reduced to these like kind of clickbaity slogans, like build the wall on the right and like on the left, kids in cages. And it seems like it's like weird because those were like slogans, but they became almost like they became like the real metric of like immigration policy. Yeah. I wonder what it's like to write about immigration from such a detailed perspective at a time when there's such a, I don't know, simple conversation about it.
So it's interesting. I am not, very enthusiastic about Biden, but one of the good things about him getting elected is like I don't have to explain that like I'm not a Trump supporter, because I've been really slamming the Democratic Party because they're essentially the same. Like this is a bipartisan issue. And there's been such, it's essentially just like theater, right? Like it's been a reality TV show. And it's really sad that things get reduced to this, like real issues get reduced to slogans and to these sound bites, right? That people hang on to, and then like you cannot convince them otherwise. Like that's it. And it's just interesting because one, Trump didn't start building a border wall. Like that was in the Bill Clinton years that they started building, essentially a wall between the U.S., along the U.S.-Mexico border. And also it was under the Obama administration that family incarceration began from migrants from Central America seeking to apply for asylum status. So when I heard Michelle Obama say kids in cages, I like almost had a stroke because like that's so perverse. Like that's more perverse, I think, than Trump and all his like stupidity, because okay, like he's kind of, like we see him and yes, he sucks, but all of this that's going on, the Democratic Party is not like they know what's going on, right? Like they know these issues and they
So it's like incredibly like disingenuous
Yes.
for Democrats to especially take a moral stance on it. Like to like, take that sort of idea of like, this is not who we are as a country, as Americans. That's especially absurd.
Yes. Yes. No. And again, like I didn't vote for Trump, but it's especially alarming that the Democratic Party doesn't have its own narrative. It doesn't. It essentially like merged into the Republican one in the 90s on like law and order and crime and criminal and alien and all this. And now they're in a tough spot because, okay, what's going to happen now? Like Biden puts this proposal out and there's no way it's going to pass. And now you're left with all these sound bites that, people rely on. Like that's their perception of things, and that's
it feels like a lot of people like on the left or liberals, whatever, the hashtag resistance are like, they basically want to know like, are there kids in cages or not? Because if they're not, then I don't have to care anymore. Like it's like this and it really like shows like how disingenuous it was. Like there was like, it was used to sort of like make Trump look like a monster when it's just sort of like, I don't know. I wonder if you could talk about, because you mentioned that like wider history. I certainly remember the Clinton years. I mean, I think that's when I like came online about knowing anything was during the Clinton years. And even then it was, Clinton was in the media as a very positive, progressive figure and doing this with a very, kind of warm, benevolent feeling to it, Fleetwood Mac and all that. But like, there's this sort of like idea that like when I hear build the wall, like I always heard like, I always seemed like there was already a wall. Like even if there were like the wall is sort of like this, I think what you identify in your work, like the wall is like this attitude of like criminality and like security and sort of like, creating this sort of like the wall is a metaphor too. You know what I mean? Like it's sort of like this. Can you talk a little bit about where that comes from? Because I always thought it was, 9/11 sort of accelerated all of that. But it started before that, right?
So it was definitely there was a fixation on the border, like at the physical border, for a while. So well before the Clinton years. Mm-hmm. And originally the Republican Party was the one that started with like the rhetoric of like illegal and this like, there was a trend of all these words like surge, invasion, like everyone, we're being attacked sort of like everyone's the barrier, the border is too porous. Like everyone's coming here for welfare, for this. And
that's right. Yeah. That's what I remember the most is sort of like the rhetoric in the 90s from the Republican Party was they're coming here and taking our welfare. Yeah.
Right. And so there were a number, it's interesting. So California, I think, is like ultimately like the future. Like California in the 90s did all these like very, very backwards. Mm-hmm. Like California did the Arizona law in the 90s, like the Arizona show me your papers law in 2010, which is more than a decade ago. Mm-hmm. But originally there was all this rhetoric and like save our state, right? And this perception of a threat of losing culture, of like losing language and identity. And after 9/11, that sort of it was still like, it's so big, right? It's a fixation of the border and also like interior enforcement, which just means like workplace raids and whatnot, like ICE. But after 9/11, it all sort of grew and just added like, in addition to being a criminal and in addition to being a moocher and, who wants welfare and, rapist and all these things, there's also now like the terrorist added into the bunch. And
I feel like the word cartel entered into the lexicon at some point. And
Yeah.
it's really weird because it's like there's such a schizophrenic attitude about immigration, like in the American imagination. Because I grew up with like this movie. I don't know if you know this movie. It was called An American Tale, and it was like a little cartoon movie with cartoon mice, immigrants, like Russian immigrants.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and it was like a very heartwarming story. It was like this heartwarming story about like immigration and the sadness of separating from your family. And there were Oscar-winning songs and stuff like that. And it feels like the Democrats like engage in that language all the time. It's sort of like
Oh,
the hope of immigration.
we are
Yeah,
a nation of immigrants. Like we
right.
are a country of, yeah, these sorts of cliches,
It's like,
sentences.
yeah, there's like a romance there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it seems like immigration is also like this engine and this source for the right to like sort of pick on like a certain sort of like a certain racial dynamic that's been there forever. It's like
Right.
a push and pull. And and there's a sentence at the end of your Jacobin piece, which is called, by the way, people should check it out. It's from last month. It's called Joe Biden's Immigration Reform Doesn't Do Enough to Help Migrant Workers. And you talk about that particular category as like what, a lot of this is all about. But there's this great sentence towards the end I thought that I should read for everyone to hear, because he said, Biden's settlement, you said it's a settlement that no doubt fits the needs of capitalists who both need these workers but also benefit from their precarious status and limited scope for collective action. So it's almost like that push and pull of that immigrant like romance and like xenophobia is also present in the policy.
Right. So it's always this double standard. It's always this, right. So you use that language that is like, we are a country of immigrants, which I think implies also, when I hear that, I'm like, okay, no, we're not talking about people like me who came to this country through the U.S.-Mexico border. Like I'm thinking, the Statue of Liberty and like all these images when I hear that.
Yeah.
First and second, there's this whole. I mean, it's not unrelated. There's this whole sort of like construction that we reinforce through language and metaphors and whatnot on deservedness, on like who deserves to be here, right? And it's hypocritical because America has been addicted to cheap labor since its inception, so it's never going to actually, in my opinion, I don't really think that it cares to really actually get rid of it, because even the corporations need it, right? So like one of the things that I mentioned is like the essential worker, right? When the last time that there was a huge national amnesty of undocumented families was Ronald Reagan, right? Like 30 something years ago. And that was really dependent on like migrant workers being sort of out of sight because they work in agriculture. They're like occupational, like segregated in certain sectors. And I think, one of the things of COVID is that it's made workers very visible. And so you have to respond to that. I think people have been more open to the idea that, the person delivering their Postmates is an undocumented person, likely, since 2/3 of essential workers are. But yeah, I don't really think that the powers that be would really be interested in solving that, in getting rid of that exploitable labor.
Well, it's like we want them and we don't, and when I say we, I mean the system of profit doesn't want the sort of social element of it. And also like that idea of like, to me, that's the scariest part of it, is like that the system would benefit, or capital would benefit from a population of people who are scared and precarious and feeling like they're going to get, arrested or separated from their family at any time. Like the fact that, like, to me, there's no like bigger indictment of capitalism than the idea that it would put people through that and not only put people, but like, benefit from it and promote it.
Yeah. And when I came to the US, I was a visa overstayer for years. So I was undocumented, which is also how over like 65% of undocumented people are here. They're visa overstayers. So the idea that a wall would be a way to solve a problem, like in quotation marks, is also like really dumb, because no, it's very few people that do that, right? It's people that have likely been through deportation proceedings and trying to reunite, like come meet their families again, and so they rely on like smuggling networks. But anyway, yeah, I was undocumented, and my first job, I would clean offices and get paid in cash. And it's very strange because I definitely have privilege in the sense that my hair, I'm sorry, my skin is like somewhat fair, right? Especially being indoors like all day. This is the palest like I have ever been in my life, and I can't. But anyway, I don't look at as what they describe on Fox News, and so I didn't go through this. I didn't go through this profiling, even though I always felt like a little dark cloud just over my head, like always, like and so.
And that dark cloud comes from feeling like you could be thrown out of the country at any point, and they're like, you're going to be discovered. Yeah.
That even if it was a nice day and everything went well, like there's still something wrong, and it lingers. It's there. I mean,
I can imagine. Yeah. I mean, I'm wondering what that process is like. I mean, maybe you can say a little bit of what like your own process was like, but also like, Biden, what has Biden changed? You know what I mean? Like what exactly has, like, in other words, what's the process like now? Because it seems like, where I'm hearing about, like here in California, they just talked about like opening the Long Beach Convention Center as a detention center, essentially. And I'm thinking about, okay, what if I were 15 years old by myself in another country, sleeping on a cot in some convention center and like surrounded by cops, and thinking like, what does that person do? Like, what is their path? Is there any process, or are they just going to sit there forever? It seems like a total fucking nightmare.
I'm so, thank you so much for asking this. This is a great question. I love this. I've gotten, I'm in academia now, so I've gotten a lot of well-intentioned people, which I think like, that's like the worst combination of people is like, oh no, like very intelligent, like eloquent people, but then we'll say something like, oh, but they should come like you did, like the right way. There's this like right way rhetoric where I'm like, okay, first of all, number one, like I was undocumented for a long time. And two, there is no right way. Like this is a language that exists, that somehow there's like a bureaucratic process that you can, go through and then be able to like enter the US. And it works like that, with work visas, if you are from Germany, or like if you are from like a European country. But if you're from Mexico or Central America, these visas that, I mean, essentially like they're non-existent, right? Like where they don't give out visas so you can come here, quote, like the right way. I think, the idea that there's there's, without even knowing too, like people are so confident when they say these things, and again, like well intentioned, I'm like, no, there's nothing. So my process is that I was a visa overstayer. I was undocumented for years, and I went before a judge. I went before a judge as like ultimate ruling of like I'm able to stay or I have to leave. And that's a sort of like emergency route, I guess. And 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 I remember that I'm like 18 or something, and I'm showing like this judge that I'm getting, that I have good grades in university, and that I really just want to like stay in the university, and I waited an afternoon, and then he came back and said that I could stay. And it's in San Antonio, Texas. It's this huge build. It was INS then, because it was before 9/11. Or
INS. Yeah. Wow, I remember that term. Yep.
And it was very sad because there were lots of families crying that I knew were there, waiting for their own response. And yeah, so the right way, there's no, like there's not really a way to do that. I mean, it's just like essentially you don't come. That's the only thing.
And yet, I mean, I wonder what is obviously there are a lot of different driving forces for why people do come, both like a push and a pull, it seems like, right? But I wonder what the culture is. I mean, I'm totally ignorant of it, but like the culture of like, it seems like it would be more of like a word of mouth thing than if there's no official channel. It's sort of like you're talking about like, should I go, should I not, with friends and family about what the possibilities are.
Right. So my dad had, even though my parents don't speak English, my dad had an opportunity to, the company that he worked for, of course, like with NAFTA and everything, like he would be able to work in an office that they had in Laredo, Texas. And my parents, my brother and my sister are still in Laredo, Texas. And so they've settled there. But yeah, there's a couple of things that happen. I mean, one, there's it comes down to work, right? Like people come because they've been offered work, and it's better than what's going on in their native country. Two, I mean, also I think there's this, like they're all conflated, like refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants who are undocumented, like they're all sort of lumped together in the same category. And maybe it's like the academic in me, but no, they're different categories, like they're different groups of people, right? Like right now, when we talk about like Central America, they're mostly looking for asylum, right? Like they're scared, like they're fleeing their countries out of fear of like losing their life, of like ultimate, death of so there are different factors to consider, and somehow still like they still get the undocumented immigrant rhetoric, like they still get like the criminal word thrown into conversation of like even though it's not like, it's not breaking the law to ask for asylum.
No, I mean, I'm still stuck on this idea that there is no right way, because it's like a really compelling one, and it to me it's like such a smug thing, and I've heard it come out of the mouths of not just white people in my life, a lot of the population I'm from in my towns are very like heavy Latino populations, that like there's a lot of middle class people and friends, and a lot of dads, and a lot of like Trump type dads that are
Yes.
like these Mexican dudes who are like, well, I came the right way and people should come the right way. And I would
Right.
categorize them as like right-wing anti-immigrant people. And
That
like
God.
that shit makes it so fucking hard, dude.
Oh yeah, no, it's weird. I know, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, and it's like really unfortunate. It's like these, like they see their way to assimilation or like to being American as like internalizing their oppression and sort of like denying their like identity. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of them that also, like were legalized with Reagan. So yeah, maybe.
What happened during the Reagan years? Because that's something that, you hear about this Republican Party, but like I think of that Republican like party that's like build the wall and like doing a really straight up like racist sort of policy and attitude towards particularly like Mexico as like a 90s Rush Limbaugh, Newt Gingrich, new conservative party sort of reaction to Clinton's. But like what was Reagan doing with immigration? Because I think that seems like it's an important part of like you tracing how this has changed over the years.
Right. So, I mean, it's not that Reagan was like this benevolent figure, right? In immigration history, it was again like dependent again like on the sort of understanding that this is happening, but it's happening and it's out of sight, and it's not something that like real Americans are going to interact with day to day, but the understanding that it serves like employers and it serves like enterprises and business is interest. So yeah, there was an amnesty, and I mean, he was not a departure from the same rhetoric, right? It's just escalated so much since then. So yeah. he wasn't having like rallies of like build the wall, but it's a constant line of like law and order, and law abiding, like these sorts of terms. And it wasn't fully. I mean, so this was in '86. So they both parties had begun like talking about immigration and illegal immigration, especially around this time. But it was still like pretty early on in the sense that like it wouldn't take, like he didn't have to wrestle like all the political capital and like social capital to get this bill passed.
I wonder, like, I don't know how much you know about this, and I'm trying to figure it out myself, like sort of like the longer sort of trajectory and arc of like the working class, because it seems like this is happening during like, I don't know, like deindustrialization and like the globalization and all those sort of buzzwords of like capitalism and American capitalism changing during this same moment. And it seems like immigrants are sort of like caught in the middle of that process, because it's like what, like NAFTA is in the 90s, right?
Right. NAFTA is in the 90s, which leads to more workers coming here the right way. I'm kidding. Like they coming here for work, and are part of like, are part of like we have like like 11 million undocumented people in the US, and that's an estimate. It's somewhat like ironic because before like there were, it's ironic because like Mexican people didn't want to stay here to live forever. Like they wanted to come work seasonally and then like go back home. And with like the escalation, because of like immigration policy became increasingly politicized, and it's like welfare. It's sort of like the same punitive tone and like history of welfare somewhat. Like there are a lot of parallels. And so the more punitive that it becomes, it's ironic that, okay, so like now workers are like trapped here because they can't go home seasonally, like and it just like adds to this like so-called like immigration problem, right, that the US has.
So, I mean, you're saying like there was a moment that you could pass between the border and a lot more easily, right? Is that
Yes.
what I mean?
Well,
Yeah.
and the federal government itself like recruited so many workers during labor shortages. Like you could like they would beg and like recruit, right? And just
Mm-hmm.
it was no big deal to cross the border. So um, that starts to change, and so people are that didn't intend on like staying here indefinitely are like, okay, well, I guess we are here. Like we can't go home because then we can't come back and work again. So it's ironic in that sense of like it wouldn't be this like 11 million people are trapped or like
Right.
hostage.
Yeah. I mean, I teach. I've been teaching in the last couple of years. I've been teaching these public speaking classes, which are classes that like everybody has to take, and it's all like freshmen from every kind of major. And it's actually like they're supposed to talk. Like one of the speeches is supposed to be like kind of a biographical thing, where they talk a little bit about their lives, and it's actually shocking. I mean, it's no longer shocking to me, but how many of them describe having families that are split across borders and saying, and I mean, they talk about like just absolutely gut wrenching things in front of everybody, and and they're sometimes like surprisingly unemotional about it because it's something they've dealt with their whole lives. But they say things like, "Well, I haven't seen my father in 12 years because he's in Mexico," and I'm just like, it's weird because we kind of tend to reduce the moral sort of like human tragedy of this down to like the kids in cages thing. But it's also just like the lives of people in the society that are experiencing this sort of immigration. And you're talking about like, this sort of dark cloud over your head at all times. It seems like just, I don't know, that there are a lot of bits of that human tragedy that we don't even really consider.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the system was initially also built for family reunification, right? Where like your family is supposed to be together. And so if family members were in other countries, that's how you would petition for them to come here and join you, right? And the whole system has moved like very far, has just completely gone in the other direction on like family separation, or I'm sorry, family reunification is not really a thing. Like family separation.
That's not the image I was given of the Biden administration. I thought, Biden's going to go down and like cut the chains off the cages himself and all the kids will be reunified. And it seems like that's sort of something that's fallen off the media's sort of attention.
So, yeah, it was interesting. Trump, as awful as it was and everything, it was at least useful for like setting a conversation of like actually like this has been going on since the Obama administration, where like families have been incarcerated and yes, the children, like there are different rules for holding them in detention, which so children are like the only population that's more regulated. Like an adult, there's no legal limit, and this went to like the Supreme Court or something, like, or maybe I'm exaggerating, but like this went, and back and forth, and ultimately like it was decided that no, there's no like legal limit as to how long you can detain an immigrant in these detention centers. So it's completely, can be forever. But the kids are more regulated, like at least like they're supposed to be in like specific facilities that get the same sort of licensing that daycares do. Anyway, the children have they go to separate agencies. So like children have gone through incarceration and then have been released from Health and Human Services to like someone who claimed was a family member without that ever being confirmed in any way. So like there was there were definitely people from Ohio like picking up kids just to make them work or like there's this whole trafficking issue that's awful and a mess, but it's sort of like the message of like, we don't care, and like we made an effort, right? Like we hand it over to the agency that it belongs to, and like someone said that they could pick them up, and so we like turned them over. But this is like in the Obama administration. Like this is like a long time ago, where like kids were being lost because they released them to somebody that like we couldn't track them. Like then the parents would be like, where are they? Yeah.
I mean, these sound like the stories that I read, like studying American history and studying like the Fugitive Slave Act, and like the days of the Underground Railroad. And like, we tend to like, I mean, I think a lot of liberals especially tend to like locate those things as like important parts of American history, like sort of like pieces of things that happened a long time ago. They're segregated into the past in a way that helps us deny that they're right in front of us. I mean, I want to know more. I don't know if you know more, but I want to know, like, who are these people that are trafficking these kids, like, into, and not just kids, but like people that are in these like fucked up situations and taking them into, meat packing plants and agricultural spaces and being like, because it seems like such a pipe. I mean, there's got to be an organized pipeline. They're not just like, people aren't just finding their way to work. The work is finding them. Right. And that seems like some really sinister shit to me.
Right. Yeah. So I had followed a few cases that were like really outstanding, sort of, like they were reported on, and they were really, really bizarre. And like, yeah, I think that this happened to a larger extent, and there's very little information. And that's by design, right? Just the fact that they like separate them and like send them into two different agencies, and also it's difficult for, I mean, I study at policy and bureaucracy, and it's like very difficult to track people and to track what's going on. Mm-hmm. And so, that the Ohio one just comes to mind because, that was like an agriculture. They just picked up a bunch of kids. But this was happening before Trump. And I think that came as a shock to a lot of people, that these awful things have been happening for a while, and are.
And I wonder about, like, I don't know how things change, and like what is the pressure? You mentioned at the end of your Jacobin piece, sort of like, some bright spots in terms of the discourse and in terms of people being engaged with this. But I mean, I wonder, just like in terms of the left, not liberals, but like the left, I don't know who that is, but like, what's the activism around this? I mean, what was Bernie's attitude towards that? Because I know like Bernie's sort of in this sort of center, weird place, when it comes to his politics, because he's sort of like an outlier in the Democratic Party. But what is the left approach to this? Because it seems like an opportunity, certainly, to like gather solidarity, but it's an issue that I don't feel like comes up very much on the left.
Right. Except for like the symbolic gestures, like not a firm policy. And I think really, so I've thought about this. I've thought about this a lot. There was a person who asked me on the street one day, and like I never,
hear you, kitty.
I know. I'm like, oh no, like.
It's all right. We love the cat. The cat wants to add some thoughts about immigration.
It's always like in the worst moment too, where anyway.
I have to lock them out. Like, I have cats outside the door right now that are locked out. Yeah.
Yeah. I try to do that, and it just
makes it worse. Yeah.
But anyway, I thought about this a lot. There was a person on the street that asked me, and I've thought about this so much. It's like something that I it's like, okay, this is like the introduction to my book, to my book project that I'm working on. This person asked me, like, what if I wanted to be brave? What if I wanted to hide someone in and be a part of the Underground Railroad? Like, what would I do? And I really mean this. Like, okay, that's part of the problem, because this thing of like individualizing a huge thing is it doesn't help. It just like is more of a burden. Like, it's the same. It's I'm right on sanctuary cities, right? And sanctuary cities essentially are the idea of like immigrants are safe here, and I've like taken the data from Department of Homeland Security like over 20 years, and overwhelmingly like there's 99% compliance always with Homeland Security and ICE when it comes to these issues, even from sanctuary cities. So again, I think that's like a well-intentioned, like very
that's
smart.
Crazy, considering that sanctuary city is such like a talk about a buzzword for the right, man. They're like just like, look at these San Francisco's a fucking sanctuary city, and like that to them means that it's like some sort of like lawless anarchy or
yes.
something. But the idea, wow, I just want to say that again, like what, like 99% compliance with Homeland Security and ICE in even sanctuary cities. That's fucking devastating.
Yeah, I mean, and it's because of 9/11, right? Like after 9/11, there are these policing programs that are set up. They're local, so any interaction with local police goes into this database with Homeland Security and ICE, and there's very little that you can do around that. So yeah, I told this person like, this is not like an individual thing. I think we have to advocate for comprehensive reform, and that's the only way. But yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think like sanctuary cities, is also a politicized word, and like people throw it out, and like some people like it makes them feel better, and then some people are like, again, like imagine this like lawless like place where like awful things happen, and but it's all in the abstract. It's interesting because I think you mentioned this earlier. It's on the abstract. Like it's funny that like Alabama, with less than like 3% of a population being immigrants and Latino immigrants, like passed like this awful, like right after Arizona passed like a very similar law that is very punitive, and they didn't have like Arizona, you can sort of rationalize it in certain ways, but how if it's this like invisible thing in Alabama, right? Like if it's like not like demographically it makes no sense, but like just from perception. And I think that like in many ways we're fighting like perceptions of things instead of like their reality.
Yeah, that's what it seems like, and that explains why people would be like, "Well, how do I be brave?" It sounds like a Netflix show. Like, how do I be the brave person right now? I mean, as someone who's like, raised by that in that sort of like, I don't know, white savior sort of mentality in Hollywood, like I understand that bleeding heart impulse. Like I remember being like, well, if there are kids in cages and you really believe that, then why aren't we all like going down there instead of doing a rally in the street, like going to do some civil action where we liberate these places, Right. And you start to think like very romantically when it seems like a lot of times the answer is like more boring, like we have to shift policy,
Yeah.
And it's like, well, the term seems so dramatic.
Right.
And it seems like dramatic for the right too, because the right sees this like invasion that they gotta gun up and do something. I mean, they're white. They're like conservative. Or what conservative? What do we call them? I call fascists. People that are like at the border with guns. You know what I mean? Like doing that type of shit. Like
the vigilantes. Yeah.
Minutemen. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, or the people that like go into the desert and like find the water and like spill or like put holes.
That's just like sadism and cruelty to me. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's like, and that to me is like when you see shit like that, I mean, like the delight in destroying like the water of like desperate people in the desert. Like it, I mean, that's just mean, And like to me, it's like that meanness and cruelty and sadism seems like it is built into the system. It is, and like that's
Yeah.
what's so like mind blowing about like trying to, I don't know, shift policy about cruelty.
Right. Right. I think a lot of it has to do with perception. A lot of it has to do with language,
Yeah.
and it's like language that we've never challenged, and it's like, you know, the sort of like political reality that we create, like we socially create with others, right? And so Trump supporters, like they've shared in that meaning of they're on the same page. I don't know what it is for the left, right? Like I think Bernie Sanders was I think Bernie Sanders was like very much the same when it came to immigration. Like he was like he spoke about this from a perspective from a labor angle of like legalizing workers so that they're not exploited, because they are being exploited, especially like under Trump. If there was like there are cases of you know, when you go to the Department of Labor because the employer didn't pay you, like wage theft. And during the Trump administration, like ICE would be there to like just collect people that were immigrants, like were undocumented, that wanted to file grievances on like wage theft. So yeah, he spoke about like legalizing workers so that they wouldn't be in this like precarious position. And he also spoke, I mean, the first time, right? Like the first time he was campaigning.
2016 you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also the first to mention no more private prison contractors also, who run the detention centers, right? They're the same.
That's something that's part of your work, I noticed too, right? Is kind of like tracking privatization.
Yeah.
What is that piece of the puzzle? Because it seems like a big one. At the same time, I'm kind of like, well, if I were in prison, I wouldn't know if it were public or private, right? Like the effect would be the same for me. But like, how does privatization drive this? Because it seems like it's a big part of the puzzle.
So the war on drugs just, you know, it grew mass incarceration to points where like that was record amount of profit, and you know, like these private prison companies like made obscene amounts of money. Essentially like they use the same tactics. Like it's like now the war on terror, right? Like that's like the main difference. But they very quickly set into place like these mechanisms that will drive up like the number of people that will be in these centers. They function the same, like they operate the same out of like it's essentially prison, right? Like people can be in the same property facility, and it's like holding immigrants as detention as a detention center also. But these companies they've been lobbying both parties since 9/11, right? And like you can see that they do it to both Republicans and Democrats, and you can see that they write in like immigration reform as a reason for their like lobby contribution. And it's $1 billion industry. I mean, just like two companies, and that like overwhelmingly make their profit from government contracts. It's $1 billion industry.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of Halliburton and war contracts and weapons manufacturers and just this sort of like macabre industries. God, that's scary.
Yeah. So that's how do you sort of get rid of that? Like even in my mind, you know, like I'm like I don't see it.
I don't know. What about like the idea of open borders on the left? I used to hear that a lot. Like in the night, like when I came of age, I say that a lot. But when I came of age, whenever I discovered the left, it was the late '90s, early 2000s, 9/11, all that sort of stuff, and the language was changing very, very quickly. But it seems like there was in the '90s, especially around globalization and around like the WTO, there was this conversation among Americans, which is amazing, about like a sort of global solidarity. And especially seeing borders as basically mechanisms through which people are oppressed, and like there was this real like open borders sort of thing. I once said like maybe because I'm like a Gen X like relic or something, but like on Twitter I said something like, oh, like I'm for open borders, and all these people were like, that's not very socialist, and I was like, what the fuck? I like all of a sudden, you know, because Bernie Sanders wasn't talking about like, I mean, I know he talks about in human terms, and he like, you know, he has that sense of him, but he's also like, he's talking about like sort of labor and, you know, the working class and how we sort of, he's not saying like we should all just be one planet, man, like that sort of thing. But I don't know. There's a romantic in me that says it's sort of like, why not with that idea? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you think about like the fixation with the border when it was like making it a site to scapegoat a lot of like so-called problems, when that's really not what was happening, but that, you know, it instilled feelings like anger, fear in people who had no sort of like, who didn't know the border, you know, like somehow they were now like fully invested in like securing the border and like protecting the border because someone told them to care. I mean, if you look at it like it's arbitrary, and it allows the movement of commerce, right? Like how much commerce like moves, just like goes back and forth in a single day. And I say this as like my family's in Laredo, which is like the largest like inland port, right? Where like merchandise and commerce like just passes through all day. So there is something in that conversation of like, okay, if commerce can move, like why can't migrants, like why not
Capital
workers,
wants no borders. Capital wants to move. Yeah, exactly what you're talking about. But people know, and that, like, to me, like that's something that's come up a couple times. I'm glad you brought it up because it seems like such a key idea.
But it's interesting because open borders. I haven't heard many conversations on like we want open borders or you know.
I mean, I know AOC is like a representative in Queens. So. But she does talk about ICE raids and all that, and it does something like it. And I do think of her as somewhat. I mean, I don't know. She said she might quit, but like I do think of her as sort of the future of whatever we call the left, you know, in Congress you know. And I'm like, what is her position on all this?
So this is great timing. She had just like posted a video of like. What's happening at the border right now is not the same as like babies being ripped from, you know, their mothers during Trump. Like it's not the same. And I understand that it's like very easy for me to be like, what, like, and tweet and be mad and whatever. But no, I think that it's a legit purpose. Or legit reason to be angry that like, no, it's not a departure from Trump. I mean, even through the 100 days of like moratorium on deportations, like there were still deportations of Black immigrants to Haiti, and that included children. And the youngest one was like a little like 2-year-old baby. So I'm still like I don't agree that like this isn't, you know, just because it sounds nicer. I don't that it's like, oh, okay, we can chill now because like it's not as bad as when Trump was president and like ripping babies from their mothers when they're breastfeeding. I mean, this is essentially like the way that the Democrats are talking about it. And it's, I disagree. It's not it's not changed. Like conditions have not changed. So pandemic, like on top of all these things, like you had like COVID outbreaks in all these detention centers and like worse. And Biden hasn't really changed anything. It's like, things are under review and or like put on the floor on like on the table, right? Like
and even when they do something, it's like it's still within that discourse of like illegal and like right ways, and like we're gonna create a path for the people that work hard and deserve it, and like this college girl sort of thing.
Yes.
No offense.
No. I completely agree. So I completely agree, and it's what I mentioned earlier. Like I think people understand that like the Postmates is coming from someone who, but there's still consciously or unconsciously, just because like this has been not just like the rhetoric in this particular realm, but like in the entire like policy world, right? Like the way that welfare, like when you look at the language of like welfare, when you look at the language of like criminal justice, like it's all very punitive, and it's all like deservedness. So yeah, even in the good things, right? Even in like, go ahead, like imagine like the best case scenario, and like what is utopia?
I'm trying to drum up some optimism here as we're trying to wrap up.
It's still like earned. Yeah, it's still the same language of like earned, and I think that's the hardest part of. If we want to change things, I think language is the big one, right? And I think of an understanding of things, and just like not perpetuating the same sort of like, but the right way, but the good ones, right? And that's been I mean, even it's in the Jacobin piece too, of like the dreamers, were of political, like their political campaign was entirely based on like their innocence, like they had nothing to do with like, being brought to the US as a baby, and then all of a sudden, like they're just here, and then they don't have status, and like, and I don't know, maybe it's like my coming of age, because I hadn't now it like makes me angry, and I like want to, I will get a stroke one day, but all these things that I didn't see as like the way that they were being presented, even though I guess at the same time, like I very much internalized like the word illegal, like I very much internalized like all the awful parts of like what I represented as a Mexican immigrant. So
yeah, it's heavy stuff. I mean, it reminds me actually of like I went to I saw some debate years ago. I think it was after 9/11, but it was like a vice presidential candidates debate, and like a bunch of Democrats were there, and like Peter Camejo was there, he was like a Green Party guy, and he was a real radical. He was like a Ralph Nader type dude. And the topic was immigration, and every Democrat gave some answer that was like, well, I think there ought to be a right path for people that deserve it and people that do good and that sort of thing. And Peter Camejo, when it came to him, he took the microphone and he was like, how are we sitting here talking about illegal human beings, And just like he brought up this, he sort of shamed everyone. But like the reaction from the audience was like, fuck you, like they were like, it was just, like no one wanted to hear it. And I thought that was, I was sitting there like I was totally in agreement with Peter Camejo. And then I was like, God, how fucking depressing is it to see everyone be like, no. Like, let's not have that like moral human element be brought into this.
Yeah, no, I think, so I think Trump was obviously like using immigration as a way to like gain political points, right? And as a way of like he
won on Build the Wall. Like, I mean, he like I have to think that all that shit about like when he like announced his campaign and said, Mexicans are rapists and we got to stop, we're going to build the wall. And like he made his whole announcement about that. Like, to
Yeah.
me, like, that wasn't just because Trump's a racist and he just wanted to say racist shit. It was very calculated. It was like, when I saw it, I was like, oh, fuck. Because coming from Southern California, I know how powerful that impulse is. And so, in other words, like, he may not even believe it. It's just new. It's powerful.
It's politically expedient. Yeah. And it's great because I teach policy. So there's all this theory that's, says the same thing of like, these are like political calculations that they may not even believe in, but for the sake of like getting points and support and voters and whatnot. But so he knew that it would get like political support. He sort of like also found like the contours, like the boundary of like, okay, this is too much, when people were complaining and people were upset over like the children being separated, right? So like the scope of okay, like this is okay to do this to this group of people, but this is too far. And so sort of learning those contours is interesting, because again, like the innocence of like the children, right? Like the children are a population where you can't talk bad about, you can't, know, like it's not like socially allowed or like encouraged. So it was interesting that like somehow like that got a lot of support and a lot of coverage. So it would be completely like political bust, right? Like political suicide to like come out and say no, like no to to not like mention the right way, like to not mention like all the ways that like immigrants are criminalized. Like that would be very like you would just
it's like you have to acknowledge that reality, like gangs and drugs, and you have to mention all this stuff. I mean, it's, to me, like there's so much racism in it and imperialism and all these attitudes that seem like they're very powerful in American history as a through line. So like that's part of why Trump knows he can activate it. It's not just like the last 30 years. It seems like it's almost like the whole project.
Right. But I'm curious, just if I could ask you something, since you mentioned, in Southern California, what is your like take on this? Like what is like the thermometer there on?
Well, I mean, I live in Ventura County, which is one of the biggest kind of agricultural centers of Southern California and maybe the world. So it's like, it's weird because the county is, and I talk about this a lot on the podcast, I guess, but growing up in a place that's sort of like bifurcated between these like middle class people that are doing a suburban Southern California upper middle class or middle class life. And then like we passed through, and I used to drive, ride on the bus to middle school through these fields where I used, in my head, I assumed I called them slaves in my head, honestly. Like, and I know that's not quite the accurate language, but either way, that was how I sort of always thought of it. And as I've come back, because I went to CUNY and I lived in Brooklyn for 15 years. And then I came back over the last couple of years to this county and with a totally different set of understandings, like of like how it all fits together. And now I teach college here, and I am in contact with a lot of the children of the people who came and worked in the fields and like talk about that. So in other words, like for the first time in my life, I'm all of a sudden like in contact with that population in a lot more, a lot more than I was in my previous period. But I mean, it's a lot of fear and a lot of anger. But I would say that the discourse about doing things the right way and deserving things is among immigrants too. Like that's like, to me, and like honestly, like teaching at CUNY, I taught at Baruch, so that was like the business school, and the immigrants there were, from a wide variety of places. Like there were a lot of Eastern European immigrants, but I mean, who were just like specifically anti-communist, like they were just fucking straight up anti-communist. But like I have to say that like there weren't a lot of like radical left, type immigrant kids or children of immigrants. They all like internalize the language of like, and I understand why. It's like in a practical way, they're like, they are the dreamers. They are the people that have got to like buy into like, I'm going to do things right. I'm going to get a job. And they're some of the people that talk most powerfully about the potential of America when there's like these American kids that are raised in the United States, whether they're white or whatever, that aren't really that invested in it, and they're just like, I don't know, whatever. It's interesting because it's probably because I'm in college and I see that population, but they're the real like strivers. They're the ones that are like really. So that makes sense. But I do wonder, like, where's the rest of that population and the people that aren't like enrolled in college?
Right.
So, I mean, I just try, I don't know everything. I try to like just kind of observe, the ways that this affects different people different ways, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
That was, we try to avoid hot takes. It seems like hot takes are like the problem almost, right? Like,
right.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I love the look on like white people's faces when they want to talk about AOC with me, and I'm like, oh, like I don't necessarily, like I'm not.
It's hard, man, though, because it's even that, like, even AOC coming out and being like, oh, well, it's different now in Biden. And people are like, oh, like they're using that itself as like a rip on, and it's like it's all about AOC. And like part of me is just like, yeah, she's a fucking Democrat. What did you expect her to be? Like, I don't like. Did you think that she was Che Guevara? Like, have a more realistic kind of vision of what we're dealing with here. You know what I mean? Like, be appreciative that there's someone that at least speaks that language and is in Congress, but don't fucking expect her to like open the borders, because that's just not her. That's not her institutional role at all.
Yeah, no, or don't make her into a celebrity either, because it's one person in Congress, and I think
in the House, she's not even a senator.
Yeah, and no, I just think we're socialized into this like individual, the individualized. I don't know, like everything is individualized, right? Like
it's a hero kind of heroes and villains.
Yeah,
it's weird. Part of me is like, well, that's what people need in order to, vote for people, and they need like some sort of like, narrative or something. And I keep waiting for that to happen with immigration, because like with the police, we get these viral videos, right? We get these like, and those seem like to be the things, for better or worse, that like cause outrage and organize people, get people in the streets. With immigration, we don't really have like viral videos. I mean, the Kids in Cages was an attempt to like hashtag something together, but it doesn't seem like it has that narrative quality in the way that it would move people, which is unfortunate.
And very much connected to policing. Like it's like, I say this with caution, because I don't want to take away, like I don't want to, like I participated in all the Black Lives Matter protests that took place like after George Floyd, and it's like, okay, I don't want to, like, this is not my movement, or you know what I mean? Like I'm here to support, not like add on like, oh hey, also like local police also are like the ones that like hand immigrants over to ICE, and like that's how it works, and so like, but it's interesting that they're very, very connected, and we don't I don't think like we like see that out of
even the police have become like a black and white issue, and it's like, I mean, it's a much more complicated thing than that. I mean, you're in New York City, right? So you understand like how complicated that engagement is. But yeah, it turns into just like, well, it's just white supremacy, and it's just this and it's just that, and like instead, it's like woven into. I mean, if people understood the immigration like security stuff, it's like woven into every bit of American life. I mean, aren't you tracking like? One of the things that I saw on your bio was that like talking about like, I think you're working on like surveillance and like just different companies that are profiting not just from like imprisoning immigrants, but like tracking them and like, surveilling, and like there's so many different entryways for tech to like get into this shit too.
Oh, and they're eager and like ready. I mean, like the use of ankle monitors like happens already. And I guess that I see that, in the Biden proposal on like reform, it mentions like using alternatives to detention. And I think of like all these companies, like it's going to It's going to come down to like surveillance and wearing something that just like tracks you all the time and indefinitely, right? As an alternative to detention. But
I'm thinking about that. You talked about that black cloud like hanging over you, and that was sort of like this metaphorical thing, you know. But like, it seems like the ankle monitor is a way to like write that into like a physical apparatus, like torture device. I mean, it's fucking scary shit. I mean, I really hope for the kind of thing you're talking about, which is a reversal in the kind of language, because it seems like it really does seem like that's the basis of it. And there's, I don't know, that's another thing the left doesn't want to talk about, which is like cultural work.
Right.
Like, how do you but it seems like a place to achieve global solidarity. Part of me is like, that's why they killed Bob Marley, man. Cause like, you know, like there was like these opportunities to, through culture, to like sort of create bonds that are otherwise not there.
Right. And it sounds like so small, but then it's also like very ambitious. I think like the language piece, like the rhetoric, like just like reflecting on the way that different metaphors are used, and like the way that they've been wired into your brain already, like all these years.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know if it's like too small or like too big.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Karina Moreno, your work brings up so many really deep thoughts for me about sort of what we're doing here. And I don't know if we came to a solution right now, but I just wanted to thank you for sharing your experiences and ideas with me.
Thank you. I'm like geeking out when I saw your message. I'm like, oh my God, like, I'm such a fan.
That's so weird for me to hear, because it's just kind of like I've been doing Nostalgia Trap for years and throw it out there, and I'm like, every time I hear someone say, "I listen to it," it's really cool. So I'm glad you found some value in it over the years.
Great.
But thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Okay, I think that's going to wrap it up for us today. I want to thank my guest, Dr. Karina Moreno. Go follow her on Twitter. I'm really looking forward to her book project. I think she's bringing angles and information and ideas about immigration and security that are really, really vital. So thank you for joining us, and I appreciate everyone listening to the show and supporting the show. If you want to join that club, you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We've got tons of bonus material for our subscribers. And like I said, we are totally listener supported, so we really appreciate the folks that are sending us some love in the form of a subscription. So thanks, and we'll talk to you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.